For executive summary, we have 6 parts. For part 1 is strategy as action. Huawei faced problem after being banned by the US. It created its own software and hardware to reduce dependence on US technology. It also expanded in other countries, helping it stay strong despite trade pressure. For part 2, we have global competitive dynamic. Companies deal with 3 major challenges: changing rules, strong competition, and limited resources. During the trade war, sudden rule changes like tariff had the biggest impact. Firms like Apple used their resources to adapt and stay ahead. For part 3 is Intel's response. Intel was hit hard when it couldn't sell chips to China. It responded by building factories at home, doing more research, and entering new markets. This action helped Intel stay competitive during the crisis. In part 4, it's Apple's strategy. Apple reduced risk by moving part of its supply chain to India and Vietnam and working with local partners. It stayed neutral in public and focused on innovation. This helped it stay stable and keep investor trust. For part 5 was local versus multinational firms in Malaysia. Local Malaysian firms like Mydin were less affected by trade issues because they use local supplies. Multinational companies face more challenges but adapted by sourcing locally and changing products to fit the market. In part 6 is regional trade agreement. Due to trade tension, companies moved to countries with better trade deals like Vietnam and Mexico. RTAs like CPTPP and RCEP help reduce tariff and give stable access to big markets, making them key to global business strategy.
Government policies now play a big role in shaping global businesses. One key example is the US tariffs on Chinese goods under President Trump, which disrupted trade and supply chains worldwide. In response, many companies shifted production, diversified their supplies, or joined regional trade agreements to reduce risk and stay competitive. This presentation focuses on how regional trade agreements have helped firms to adapt to these changes, avoid trade barriers, and build stronger supply chains. It highlights how businesses use strategy to stay resilient in a divided global market.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Ismail Mahfuz bin Abdul Mayas. I will presenting the first part, which is strategy as action. The idea of strategy as action means that strategy isn't just a fixed plan we follow. Instead, something that keeps changing based on what's happening in the market. It includes the smart move and quick reaction a company makes to stay ahead of competitors. Companies need to act early, respond fast to changes, and take real steps to improve their position. The research shows that companies that act more often and in different areas of their business and have a better chance of staying competitive. For the first question is select one MNC company that affected by the US-China trade war. One international company that was badly affected by the US and China trade war is BYD, a Chinese company that makes electric vehicles and batteries. BYD is one of the biggest EV makers in the world, selling its product in China and many other countries. But when the trade war began, the US government added high taxes, which is called tariff, on Chinese-made products, including car parts and EV components. This made it more difficult and expensive for BYD to sell things like electric buses and batteries in the US. Next, to stay competitive during the US-China trade war, BYD took two main strategic actions. First, for market repositioning, BYD changed its focus from the US to other regions like Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. This place had fewer trade barriers, making it easier to sell their products. BYD also worked on its image by promoting itself as a clean energy and eco-friendly brand. This helped attract customers and government that care about green technology. Second, BYD made smart supply chain changes. The company built a factory in California to make electric buses locally. This helped avoid high taxes and allowed BYD to get support from the US government. It also expanded battery production in other countries, not only in China.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Aisha Khadija. Right now, I'll be presenting about how global businesses can survive and stay competitive during international challenges like the US-China trade war. To do this, companies need to focus on 3 main areas, which are institution-based considerations, industry-based consideration, and resource-based considerations. Let me begin with institution-based considerations. These are the formal and informal rules that shape how businesses operate in different countries. Formal institutions include laws, regulation, tariffs, and trade policies. Informal ones include cultural values, social expectation, and ethical norms. A clear example of how this affects business is the US-China trade war, when the United States government placed tariffs as high as 25% on Chinese imports. Many companies face rising costs and supply chain disruption. One well-known example is Harley-Davidson. Because of increased tariffs, they moved some of their production to Thailand to avoid extra costs when exporting to Europe. Apple also had to deal with these challenges, especially since they rely heavily on Chinese suppliers. This example shows that businesses must always pay close attention to government decisions and international policy changes to avoid risks and losses. Now, let's move on to industry-based considerations. This refers to understanding the competition and market condition within a specific industry. During the trade war, industries that rely on Chinese manufacturing, such as electronic, furniture, and apparel, were heavily affected. However, companies like Samsung were better prepared because they had already diversified their production to Vietnam. At the same time, Chinese companies like Huawei faced global restrictions that affected their performance. Some Vietnamese electronics manufacturers even gain more opportunities as US firms look for new suppliers. So, this shows that companies who stay alert to market trends and industry movements can turn risks into opportunities. The third one is resource-based considerations. This is about the internal strengths and capabilities of a company. These include financial resources, skilled workers, advanced technology, strong supplier relationships, and brand reputation. A great example of this is Apple. Even though the trade war brought big challenges, Apple was able to respond quickly because of its strong financial position and global influence. The company expanded production to India and Vietnam to reduce its risk. Similarly, Nike had already moved much of its production to Vietnam and Indonesia, which gave them an advantage when tariffs hit Chinese-made products. These cases prove that companies with strong internal resources are more flexible and better prepared to face global challenges. Among these three areas, institution-based considerations are the most important when we look at the US-China trade war. That is because the entire situation was caused by sudden government policies and trade laws. These former institutions forced companies to take fast action. Without understanding and responding to these policy changes, companies could have faced major financial losses or even failure in some markets. To conclude, in today's global business environment, understanding and adapting to institutional changes is the most critical step to staying competitive, especially when international politics and trade policies shift so quickly. That's all from me. Thank you.
For part 3, Attack and Counterattack, I am going to walk you through how Intel responded to the US-China trade tensions, especially when it comes to the semiconductor industry. So, the main focus here is the impact of US-China trade conflict, especially on multinational corporations like Intel. As one of the top semiconductor manufacturers in the world, Intel has been hit hard by the ongoing tensions. Most of this started when the US government placed export restrictions on advanced chip technology, mainly due to national security concerns. These policies didn't just limit Intel's ability to do business in China, but they also led to retaliatory actions from the Chinese government itself. Now, let's look at the US attack more closely. Under the US trade restrictions, Intel was banned from selling its most advanced AI and high-performance chips to Chinese companies, which made it harder for China to develop powerful computing systems. There were also tariffs on semiconductor components, which made it more expensive to produce and export chips. Lastly, Intel was forced to cut ties with several Chinese tech firms, which hurt its presence in one of its biggest markets. In response to all of this, Intel came up with a smart counterattack strategy, which can be broken into three parts. First, they focus on strengthening domestic production and R&D. They invested heavily in local manufacturing, especially in Arizona and Ohio, to reduce the dependency on overseas supply chain. They also sped up the development of alternative AI chips that could still be exported to China, ensuring they kept the revenue flowing despite the restrictions. Second, Intel worked on diversifying their global market. They expanded into Europe and Southeast Asia, like Germany and Malaysia, to open up new opportunities. At the same time, they built stronger partnerships with non-Chinese firms, especially in Japan and South Korea, to maintain their competitive edge. And lastly, they took some legal and diplomatic steps, like they lobbied US policymakers to ask for exemptions from certain export restrictions. On the Chinese side, when Intel was accused of monopoly practices, they actively worked through diplomatic channels to manage the tension.
For Part 4, it has two strategies. The first one is cooperation and another one is signaling. For cooperation, it has relocating supply chain. Apple began moving some production to countries like India and Vietnam. For example, Apple worked closely with Foxconn, which makes iPhone. Foxconn increased export from India to the US to avoid tariff on China's goods. This move is part of the China Plus One strategies, where companies add new countries to their supply chain to reduce risk. Labor is also cheaper in India and Vietnam, which helps lower the cost. They are also working with government in India and Vietnam. Apple built strong partnership with India and Vietnam to support its expansion. In India, Apple joined the Make in India program and received tax benefit and support. Foxconn invested over $2.5 billion in different states in India. Apple also opened its first store there in 2023. In Vietnam, Apple worked with the government to speed up production and improve infrastructure. This partnership helped Apple shift part of its supply chain outside China and lower future rates. For signaling, it has 2 points. For first point is staying neutral with China. Apple stayed neutral and didn't take political sides. It used quiet diplomacy, which talking to Chinese officials privately instead of making public statements. CEO Tim Cook visited China to maintain good relationship. Apple also followed China's data law, even though it was criticized. This helped Apple keep its brand image safe and continue doing business smoothly in China. For a second point is long-term investment signals. While many companies cut spending during the trade war, Apple kept investing. It opened new research centers in places like Germany and Japan. For example, it invested 1 billion euros in a German technology center. Apple also made sure its supply chain was responsible by tracking materials like cobalt to avoid child labor. This move showed that Apple remains strong, responsible, and focused on long-term growth even during uncertain times.
Part 5 explains how local firms and multinational enterprises handle tariff. Local firms struggle more than big companies because they have less money and fewer options. To deal with tariff, they may switch to buying materials from other countries like Vietnam instead of China. They also try cut costs and work nearby partners. However, it's still hard for them. Sometimes the government helps by giving tax or financial support. Multinational companies are stronger and can handle tariff more easily. They have more money, better system, and work in many countries. When the US added tariff on China, some big companies like Apple moved factories to places like Vietnam or India. They also use technology to manage their supply and fix quickly. These companies can afford to lose money for a while and plan for the future. Some even work with government to protect their business. Moving on is to the last part, which is part 6, latest issues of international business strategy. Firstly, the rise of regional trade agreement. Regional trade agreements or RTAs are becoming more important in global business, especially after the US imposed tariffs on Chinese goods. Countries and multinational companies are now using RTAs to reduce trade costs, handle geopolitical issues, and access foreign market more easily. This shift is making businesses rethink their supply chains and market strategies. Another one is a strategic response to US-China tariffs. The US-China trade will cause many firms to face higher costs and uncertainty. In response, companies started moving operations to countries in trade agreements like CPTPP, RCEP, and USMCA. These agreements offer more stable and cheaper market access. Moreover, access to tariff-free markets, RTAs allow countries to trade with reduced or no tariffs at all. This makes countries like Vietnam and Mexico attractive to investors as they offer lower cost access to major markets. Exporting from these countries is cheaper compared to China, where tariffs still apply. Another one is institutional alignment and stability. RTAs provide formal rules and clear regulation that help companies operate more predictable across borders. Agreements like CPTPP cover labor laws, digital trade, and dispute processes, reducing risk and supporting smoother trade. Next, supply chain realignment. To benefit from RTAs, companies are moving manufacturing out of China to countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico. This reduces dependency on China and spread production risk. It also supports nearshoring and friendshoring, bringing production closer to markets or to politically stable countries. Last but not least, competitive advantages for member countries. Countries in RTAs attract more foreign direct investment or FDI because they offer lower costs and fewer trade barriers. For example, Vietnam benefits from CPTPP and EU trade, while Mexico gains from USMCA access to North America.
In conclusion, the US-China trade war created many challenges for international companies. However, it also pushed them to take smart action. Companies like BYD, Intel, and Apple changed their strategies by moving production, entering new markets, and working with local government to stay competitive. This project shows that businesses need to understand three important things, which is government rules, competition in the industry, and their own strength. This helps them make better decisions during global problems like tariff. We also learned that trade agreements like CPTPP and RCEP help companies trade more easily and avoid high taxes. In today's fast-moving world, companies must be flexible and ready to adapt in order to succeed.